Something remarkable is unfolding in Washington right now, and it isn't being driven by the opposition. For the first time, Republicans themselves are pushing back against Donald Trump, quietly working to limit the authority he's determined to retain at any cost. Emergency declarations, war-level rhetoric, and behind-the-scenes anxiety are colliding as Congress steps in to draw boundaries. This is not just another partisan clash or a fleeting breaking news cycle. It's a test of whether American power is governed by law or by the instincts of a single individual. Stay with this to the end, because what's happening here could reshape how power functions in the United States long after today's headlines disappear. Picture Washington late at night, phones lighting up across Capitol Hill, aides speaking in hushed tones, senators checking their screens twice, convinced they must be misreading what's there, because the President of the United States is furious, not at Democrats, not at the media, but at his own party. And for the first time in a long while, the rebellion isn't coming from protesters outside the gates. It's coming from inside the walls, and that's always where the real danger begins. Because right now, Republicans are rebelling against Donald Trump. And no, this isn't the usual MAGA infighting or anonymous leaks designed to spook donors. This runs deeper, colder, and carries far greater consequences because it strikes at the one thing Trump believes he cannot live without: unchecked power. And the reason this revolt matters isn't simply that some supporters feel betrayed over broken promises. Whether it's the pledge of no new wars, the rising cost of living, or the lingering unanswered questions tied to long-promised disclosures that never seem to materialize. It's that Republican lawmakers themselves are beginning to openly move against the very authority Trump is desperate to hold on to. And when that happens, when the internal guardrails of the system start to engage, presidents don't respond with calm reflection. They escalate, they dramatize, they declare emergencies. And that is exactly what we're watching unfold. A presidency leaning heavily into spectacle and crisis language to shield itself from internal collapse. At the core of this revolt is a simple but chilling reality that even seasoned Washington veterans are struggling to articulate aloud. The President of the United States has been publicly entertaining the idea of using military force in ways that could drag America into conflict, not with a distant adversary, but with its own allies. When Senator Chris Murphy laid this out bluntly, it landed like a shockwave, because once you strip away the bravado and branding, what remains is a scenario that sounds absurd, until you remember we're no longer allowed to dismiss these statements as jokes. Greenland is not an empty space on a real estate map. It is part of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally, and NATO's core principle is collective defense. That means any military action against that territory isn't symbolic posturing. It's a legal and strategic nightmare that could, in theory, place the United States in direct conflict with Europe. The fact that lawmakers now feel compelled to seriously explain this to the public is itself evidence of how unmoored the conversation has become. No one in America voted for a presidency that risks a shooting war with allies over land acquisition rhetoric. And yet, here we are, parsing comments, weighing hypotheticals, and watching members of Trump's own party quietly but firmly try to shut the door before it's kicked wide open. This is where Trump's worldview becomes essential to understanding the backlash. He doesn't process geopolitics through alliances, treaties, or shared security obligations. He views it as property, leverage, a deal that can be forced if you push hard enough. That mindset might work in a boardroom. In global politics, it gets people killed. Republican senators know this. They understand that once a president frames military action as an option, the machinery starts moving whether Congress approves or not. That's why the War Powers Act suddenly became the battlefield, not as an abstract constitutional debate, but as an emergency brake. And when that brake was pulled, when Republicans joined Democrats to advance a resolution limiting the president's ability to act unilaterally, Trump didn't respond with persuasion or compromise. He responded with rage, profanity, and threats, because that's what happens when someone who believes power is personal realizes it's actually conditional. The reported phone call to Senator Susan Collins wasn't about a single vote. It was about the shock of discovering that loyalty has limits, that even within his own party, there are lines that cannot be crossed without resistance. For Trump, that resistance feels existential. His entire second-term strategy depends on projecting strength, inevitability, and total control. And nothing shatters that image faster than members of your own party publicly telling you no, especially when the stakes involve war, authority, and constitutional boundaries. From there, the narrative accelerates. Faced with pushback, Trump doesn't retreat. He reframes. He reaches for emergency language, declaring extraordinary measures not just as policy tools, but as political weapons. The declaration of a national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil assets fits neatly into this pattern. It allows him to cast himself as the lone guardian of national security while portraying dissenting lawmakers as obstacles, even though the underlying reality is far more complex, involving long timelines, massive corporate interests, uncertain infrastructure, and benefits that would largely flow to multinational energy companies rather than ordinary Americans. But complexity has never been the point. The point is dominance, distraction, and narrative control. Emergencies change the rules. Emergencies centralize authority. Emergencies redirect attention away from uncomfortable questions. And there are few questions more uncomfortable for this administration right now than why long-promised transparency efforts have stalled, why document releases have been delayed, and why it took bipartisan pressure rather than executive initiative to advance certain oversight actions. When lawmakers like Sheldon Whitehouse begin speaking openly about Inspector General compliance failures and missed timelines, it signals something important, not a verdict, not an accusation, but a concern that the process itself has broken down. And that concern is exactly what Trump cannot afford. His political survival depends not only on winning arguments, but on exhausting the public, flooding the zone, and ensuring every controversy competes for oxygen. That's why these threads, Republican revolt, war powers, emergency declarations, and stalled disclosures, are not separate stories. They are the same story viewed from different angles. A presidency trying to outrun accountability by accelerating chaos. Republicans who once waved everything through are now calculating the cost of silence, weighing institutional damage against party loyalty, and realizing that if they don't act now, they may not recognize the system later. Because once a president openly suggests he is guided solely by his own judgment, rather than law, treaties, or precedent, the question stops being partisan and becomes structural, and that is the moment we're in. Behind closed doors, Republicans are asking themselves whether stopping Trump is betrayal or preservation. History doesn't remember who tweeted the loudest. It remembers who intervened when the rules bent past their breaking point. This revolt, quiet in some places, explosive in others, may be the first real sign that the internal guardrails are finally being tested, not by the opposition, but by those who understand exactly how dangerous unchecked power becomes when it's wrapped in grievance, spectacle, and the language of permanent emergency. As this internal rebellion deepens, the real story shifts from what Trump is saying publicly to what Republicans are doing privately. Behind the cameras, behind the outrage posts and carefully worded statements, There is a growing recognition among GOP lawmakers that they are no longer dealing with a conventional presidency. They are dealing with a leader who treats every institutional limit as a personal insult. And that realization is changing behavior in ways that would have been unthinkable a year ago. When the War Powers Resolution advanced with Republican votes, it wasn't an accident or a lapse in discipline. It was a calculated move by senators who understand that once unilateral military threats, especially toward allied territory, become normalized, Congress becomes irrelevant unless it reasserts itself. That fear isn't ideological, it's constitutional. The War Powers Act exists precisely for moments like this, when a president's instincts outrun the safeguards of the system. Trump's response, profanity, intimidation, threats of political destruction, only reinforced concerns that his decision-making is driven less by strategy and more by impulse, grievance, and obsession with legacy. Legacy matters here. Trump's fixation on being remembered as dominant, transformative, historically consequential is colliding with the reality that his promises haven't produced stability, prosperity, or restraint. And when the myth of no new wars collapses under the weight of aggressive military rhetoric, even loyal supporters begin to fracture. Wars aren't abstractions to voters. They are costs, risks, and consequences. Republicans facing re-election understand that no amount of branding can sell a conflict with allies as a victory. That's why Trump's pivot toward emergency powers feels less like leadership and more like panic. Emergencies allow him to bypass debate, marginalize dissent, and reframe opposition as sabotage. This tactic has a long global history. Leaders who feel authority slipping reach for extraordinary measures to freeze the moment in their favor. In Trump's case, the Venezuelan oil emergency is a textbook example of framing economic assets as security imperatives, even when practical benefits are distant, uncertain, and largely corporate. Emergency language isn't about feasibility or timelines. It's about optics, control, and dominance of the narrative. While the administration insists it's protecting American interests, lawmakers on both sides see something else, a strategic distraction designed to divert attention from oversight, internal dissent, and growing scrutiny of executive follow-through. This is where Trump's relationship with his own party turns openly adversarial. He doesn't seek support, he demands submission. When senators assert independence, he treats it as betrayal, not governance. He threatens careers publicly while privately relying on those same senators for confirmations, legislation, and institutional cover. That contradiction exposes the fragility of his position. Power built on fear rather than coalition eventually turns inward. We're watching that process unfold as Republican senators quietly coordinate, compare notes, and decide when and where to draw lines that once felt impossible. This calculation is driven by a broader fear that Trump's rhetoric about law and authority is no longer symbolic, but operational. When a president suggests he's governed by personal judgment rather than constitutional constraint, it signals a worldview where rules exist only when convenient. And lawmakers understand that precedent outlives presidencies. If norms collapse now, they won't magically return later. This anxiety has turned routine votes into flashpoints, phone calls into confrontations, and policy disagreements into existential tests of institutional survival. All of it unfolds against a backdrop of public confusion and fatigue, where spectacle overwhelms substance. That confusion isn't accidental, it's strategic. A crowded information environment favors those who thrive on chaos. Trump has always known that if everything is breaking news, nothing is accountability. That's why the convergence matters. The war powers fight, The emergency declaration, the Republican revolt, the stalled disclosures, these are interconnected stress fractures in a system being pushed beyond its design. Republicans who once justified everything as temporary are now confronting the truth that silence isn't neutral. Inaction becomes consent. That realization has shifted the party's internal tone from loyalty to triage. The question is no longer how to help Trump win the next cycle, but how to prevent irreversible institutional damage after he's gone. That shift, subtle but profound, is why this revolt feels different. It isn't ideological. It's alarm-driven. Lawmakers recognize that when emergency powers become routine and war rhetoric becomes casual, the line between governance and authoritarianism blurs. And once it vanishes, it rarely returns without cost. Trump senses this shift, which is why his rhetoric has grown sharper, more apocalyptic, and his reliance on emergency authority more pronounced. Leaders who feel control slipping don't slow down. They accelerate. They demand loyalty tests. They insist only they can save the nation, even as their actions generate the instability they warn against. While public debate fixates on war powers and emergencies, a quieter pressure builds beneath the surface. Each escalation shines a light on what the administration seems desperate to outrun: oversight, documentation, timelines, accountability. This is where the story darkens, not into conspiracy, but into process failures and unanswered questions. When lawmakers ask why disclosures are delayed or deadlines missed, they aren't alleging guilt. They're identifying red flags. Red flags matter because they invite scrutiny, and scrutiny is the one thing a presidency built on speed and dominance struggles to manage. Delayed document releases have become sensitive precisely because the administration elevated transparency into a defining promise, only for reality to lag behind rhetoric. When senators publicly point to timelines, numbers, and compliance rather than theories, the issue transforms into an administrative credibility test. Credibility is the currency of governance. Once questioned, every explanation faces skepticism. Requests for Inspector General review aren't accusations. They're acknowledgments that something in the process failed: mismanagement, delay, conflicting priorities. For an administration already facing internal revolt, that pressure compounds. Inspectors general don't operate in the realm of rallies or tweets. They deal in records, memos, and chains of decision-making. Their work doesn't vanish with outrage cycles. Trump's strategy becomes clear in the pattern. As scrutiny tightens, narratives widen. Emergencies are declared. External threats emphasized. The conversation shifts from compliance to confrontation. It's instinctive. Flood the zone, change the subject, raise the stakes. But Congress isn't an audience. It's a co-equal branch. Some lawmakers are beginning to act like it again, pressing subpoenas, tracing financial paths, and asking why oversight wasn't proactive if transparency truly mattered. This isn't about proving outcomes, it's about explaining processes. And processes don't have feelings, they have records. Records are stubborn. They don't care how loudly anyone insists on their own version of events. The deeper inquiries go, the more they collide with Trump's preferred mode of control: narrative dominance over institutional disclosure. That collision frightens him because it limits his ability to redefine reality on demand. That fear explains why loyalty rhetoric has intensified, why dissent is framed as sabotage, and why bipartisan oversight is painted as warfare. Accepting neutral review means accepting outcomes you can't fully control. Trump equates control with survival. Republicans can see the convergence: war powers challenged, emergency authority scrutinized, disclosure processes questioned, party unity fraying simultaneously. This isn't a bad news week, it's a systems test. Some Republicans now quietly admit the real risk isn't what oversight might uncover, but what happens if oversight fails altogether. Systems that can't examine themselves become brittle. Brittle systems don't bend, they shatter. That awareness has shifted conversations from defense to distance, from justification to insulation. Lawmakers are calculating how to separate their constitutional duties from a presidency that treats those duties as obstacles. Trump presses forward,